It was a chilling scenario. Three men posing as HOA officials attempted to force their way into a quiet suburban home deep in the middle of the night. Hiding behind fake badges and a fabricated sense of authority, they clearly thought no one would dare question them. They banked on fear and confusion, keeping the family silent. However, they didn't count on Mark Davis, a retired Navy SEAL and protective father, who drew a line they would profoundly regret crossing. Wait until you hear how this tense standoff unfolded and why, in the end, justice didn't just knock, it kicked down the front door. It all began with a knock. Not frantic, not gentle, just 3 solid hits, as if the person at the door knew the house was asleep and simply didn't care. The digital clock on Ethan Davis's nightstand blinked 3:12 a.m. in a soft red glow, the kind of time that feels inherently wrong, even without an obvious reason. The 17-year-old stirred in bed, initially unsure if the sound he'd heard was real or just part of a dream. It took a moment for his sleep-fogged brain to catch up. Then came the second knock, louder this time, firmer, the kind that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to instinct. Ethan sat bolt upright, his heart skipping a beat. The house was supposed to be still quiet. This was Florida. Unsettling things like this didn't happen here, especially not in their neighborhood. He held his breath, listening intently. Silence followed. Then, crash, something downstairs hit the floor hard. It wasn't just dropped, it was knocked over forcefully. The shattering pop of ceramic or glass echoed up from the hallway, followed by a faint thud, like someone brushing heavily against a wall. Now, he was fully awake. He swung his feet to the floor, adrenaline surging, catching up with his racing pulse. Just half a second later, something moved at his door, low and fast. It was his sister. 10-year-old Sophie slid into the room like a whisper. Her pajama shirt rumpled, her eyes wide with an emotion Ethan had never seen in her before, pure, unadulterated fear. She didn't speak at first. She just crawled towards him, her small hand clutching the door frame as if it were the only solid thing in her world. "They're at the back door," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "3 guys. I saw them through the upstairs window. They're wearing those orange HOA badges. They've got clipboards and little radios." Ethan blinked, trying desperately to make sense of it. The HOA. At 3 in the morning, Sophie shook her head vehemently. One of them pulled out a crowbar. He was trying to hide it, but I saw it. That's when the cold crept in, the kind that has nothing to do with open windows or malfunctioning heaters. It crawled down Ethan's spine, making everything seem to slow down. Sure, the HOA could be annoying, sending letters about uncut grass parking violations or mailbox paint colors, but they absolutely didn't conduct night visits. They didn't come armed. And they certainly didn't sneak around the back door carrying tools meant for breaking in. Something was terribly wrong, and whatever it was already inside their perimeter. Suddenly aware of the danger, Ethan stood up slowly and moved towards the hallway. From there, he could hear faint murmurs downstairs, voices too quiet to understand, but unnervingly too calm to belong to anyone panicked or confused. This wasn't some bizarre misunderstanding. This felt like a setup, and someone was actively trying to get in. Ethan didn't need to say a word. The second his father stepped into the hallway and caught his son's expression, alert, scared, uncertain, something shifted behind Mark Davis's eyes. It was a flicker, a look that had nothing to do with everyday fatherhood and everything to do with something older, deeper, highly trained. This wasn't confusion or simple curiosity. It was recognition. Mark glanced towards the stairs, then towards the back of the house, where faint, calm voices could now be heard murmuring just outside the kitchen. 2 calm. He didn't waste time asking questions. He didn't need to. The man had spent 2 decades serving in perilous places most people only read about. He'd seen enough to know instantly when a situation didn't add up, and absolutely nothing about this, the time, the noise, the method of entry, felt right. Without speaking, Mark turned and walked purposefully into the master bedroom, his steps quiet and measured. Ethan followed a few paces behind, trying not to breathe too loudly, careful not to break the charged stillness his father had stepped into, as if the very air had changed the moment Mark understood the gravity of what was happening. Inside the walk-in closet was a biometric gun safe. There was no panic, no drama. Mark calmly pressed his thumb to the reader, waited for the soft click, and opened it. Inside, everything was arranged with the kind of meticulous precision that comes only from routine familiarity and discipline. He retrieved the AR-15. Standard issue for some, but for Mark, it was more than just a firearm. It was a tool he knew intimately, perhaps better than most people knew their own phones. He checked it, loaded it, and chambered around, all in complete focused silence. Ethan stood frozen, watching. He'd never seen his dad like this. Not angry, not overtly afraid, just intensely focused. Finally, Mark turned and looked his son directly in the eyes. His voice was calm, utterly controlled. "Stay behind me," he instructed. "If they come through that door, we don't talk. We end it." There was no bravado or melodrama in his voice, just a hard truth that needed to be stated aloud just once. It wasn't a line from a movie. It was the kind of statement a man makes when he's lived long enough to understand how rapidly things can escalate from bad to catastrophic, and how quickly a single decision can dictate the difference between loss and survival. Ethan nodded wordlessly. That was all Mark needed. He moved towards the hallway, his steps silent but ready. Every fiber of his being, his body language, his breath, his posture communicated one thing loud and clear. This house was not defenseless, and the individuals attempting to test that fact were about to find out just how wrong they were. The house was never supposed to sound like this. Below them, on the other side of the stairwell, came the steady creak of footsteps, moving over mulch and then tile. A deliberate scrape, then a shuffle, followed by a voice. "We've had complaints about your landscaping. We need to inspect the side entrance." The tone sent a chill down Ethan's spine. It was too formal, too rehearsed, as if the man had practiced the line or perhaps used it at other doors before theirs. Ethan moved cautiously to the guest bedroom window, staying low. He lifted the corner of the blind just enough to peer outside. He saw 3 men, likely in their late 20s or early 30s. They looked athletic, but were clearly not in official uniforms, no police or city inspector gear. Instead, they wore cargo pants, mismatched vests, and cheap-looking orange tags clipped to their belts that resembled something from a hardware store's name badge kit. One held a clipboard, another fiddled with a small radio. The third man, the biggest of the 3, wore gloves and clutched in his right hand, barely visible under a folded pamphlet, was a crowbar. Ethan felt it immediately. These guys weren't from the HOA. They weren't there to discuss grass height. They were playing a part, but the performance was thin, the edges frayed. These weren't inspectors, and they clearly weren't planning on leaving peacefully. By the time Ethan turned to check, Mark was already halfway down the stairs. His movements were silent, almost unnaturally fluid, reminiscent of his days back on patrol, clearing rooms, ghosting through potentially hostile buildings. Ethan followed from a safe distance, his heart pounding, trying desperately not to step on any floorboard that might creak. From below came more noise, One of the men tried the back door handle, rattling it vigorously. Then he tapped the glass lightly, as if that minimal effort would somehow justify his next move. The sound then shifted softer, a distinct metallic click, followed by a pressure groan from the door frame. They were forcing it. Ethan held his breath. Mark positioned just out of view in the hallway's shadows, weapon lowered, but Reddy didn't speak at first. His stance alone communicated a clear message. This was the line. And then his voice cut through the tension, clear and cold, last warning. It was low, but carried immense weight. It didn't need volume to convey power and finality. Outside, one of the men froze mid-step. He looked directly towards the house, towards the spot where the voice had originated, though he couldn't see the man hidden in the shadows. For a tense moment, everything stopped. It felt like time itself held its breath. Then the man moved fast and aggressive. He shoved the now compromised door open and stepped decisively across the threshold. That was the precise moment it stopped being a question of what if and became terrifyingly real. The man who stepped through the door clearly had no idea what awaited him. He moved quickly, shoulders squared, attempting to project an air of officialdom, still clutching his clipboard as if it were a shield, granting him invisibility. But the instant his boot hit the tile floor, everything shifted. Mark was already positioned perfectly in the shadow of the hallway, calm and locked in. In another life, this might have been a drill, but there was nothing simulated about tonight. Without the slightest hesitation, Mark raised his rifle and fired. One shot deliberately aimed upwards. The muzzle flash illuminated the room like a sudden bolt of lightning. The ceiling cracked audibly as the round struck true, and a cascade of plaster dust rained down like dry snow, mixing with the startled gasp that followed the overwhelming sound. In the confined space of a quiet suburban home, a single rifle shot echoed like an explosion. For a heartbeat, everything froze again. Time stretched, thickened. Then, Mark's voice broke the silence. Down face on the ground. It wasn't a shout, nor was it desperate. It was direct, sharp, trained. The voice of someone accustomed to giving orders in far worse situations, who knew precisely when repetition was unnecessary. The man in the doorway flinched as the dust settled around him. His clipboard dropped to the floor with a dull clack. Then, without a word, without any sign of resistance, pure instinct took over. He bolted back outside, sprinting frantically, his shoes slipping on the wet deck as he disappeared into the darkness beyond the dim porch lights. But Mark didn't lower his weapon, because the second figure was already in motion. The next intruder came in fast, ducking slightly, clearly focused, and visibly armed. There was absolutely no time for negotiation. Ethan, still crouched halfway up the stairs, saw the glint of metal before anything else. The second man raised a handgun, not clumsily, but with obvious lethal intention. Mark didn't flinch from his position. He didn't speak. He simply acted. 2 shots, controlled, sequential. The first struck the intruder's shoulder. The man twisted violently to the side, a surprised grunt escaping his lips. The second round hit lower, decisively knocking the balance right out from under him. He crashed heavily onto the kitchen tile, the handgun sliding across the floor, spinning to rest under a nearby chair. The man let out a strangled sound, not quite rage, not quite a scream, but something agonizingly in between, a noise born of confusion, searing pain, and the dawning horrific realization that he had chosen the absolute wrong house. Ethan didn't move. He couldn't. From his vantage point on the staircase, he could see the scene only in jarring fragments: the open back door, the fallen man, the harsh light bouncing off the tile floor, the lingering haze of plaster dust still settling from the ceiling. But most vividly, he saw his father. Mark didn't look triumphant or shaken. He just looked ready, steady, as if this was exactly what he had trained for. Not the specific action, perhaps, but the critical moment, the moment when the world crosses a line and it becomes one's job to hold it. Mark moved forward slowly, meticulously scanning the doorframe, the windows, the deep shadows beyond the porch. His voice, quiet now, reached Ethan's ears like a grounding weight amidst the chaos. "Still two out there? Don't move." Ethan nodded, barely breathing. But something inside him shifted profoundly. He wasn't just watching anymore. Somehow, he was part of this now. Ethan had never felt more intensely awake in his entire life. From the top of the stairs, he had witnessed the entire terrifying sequence. The warning shot, the first intruder's hasty retreat, the decisive takedown of the second. Every sound, every motion seemed amplified sharper. His father had moved like someone rewinding an old, ingrained memory, calm, brutally efficient, seemingly unstoppable. And Ethan, he had remained frozen, watching, processing, too afraid to move, yet too focused to look away. Until something else shifted, a flicker of movement caught in the corner of his eye. The side window, the one near the dining room. Someone was trying to get in there. It had to be the third man, the lookout, the one who'd stayed lurking in the shadows while the others made the initial push. Now seizing the distraction, he was circling the house, likely thinking the side entrance would be an easier target. Ethan's breath caught. For a split second, he waited, expecting his dad to notice, to call out, to move again, to handle it, just like he handled everything else. But Mark was still in the kitchen, weapon trained on the injured man on the floor, his eyes vigilantly fixed on the back door. There was no time. Ethan's feet were moving before his brain fully registered the decision. He crossed the landing, bounded down the remaining stairs in 3 sharp, adrenaline-fueled steps, and veered towards the fireplace in the living room. The fire poker, long, blackened, cold steel, sat resting against the bricks. He grabbed it firmly with both hands. There was no plan, no conscious thought, just pure, instinctual motion. The window creaked as it began to slide open, just a few inches at first, enough for fingers, then a hand to slip through. Ethan didn't hesitate. He rushed forward and swung the heavy poker, striking the glass with a force he didn't know he possessed. It cracked instantly, then shattered loudly, just as the man was starting to leverage himself to climb in. The sharp noise echoed violently through the room, followed immediately by a muffled yell and the distinct sound of someone pulling back fast. The figure outside vanished from view, stumbling away into the darkness. Ethan stood there, chest heaving, fingers still clenched tightly around the poker's handle, the metal trembling slightly in his grip. Behind him, Mark turned sharply at the noise weapon, still at the ready. But when he saw his son, standing there framed by the jagged edges of broken glass radiating raw courage, something flickered in his expression. Not surprise, but recognition. In that moment, Ethan wasn't just the kid his dad had sworn to protect. He was someone who had stood the line with him, someone who had made a critical choice. Ethan didn't speak. He just nodded once, resolutely, and tightened his grip on the poker again, just in case the third man decided to come back. He was fully in this now, and there was absolutely no going back. The profound silence following the last gunshot didn't last long. Far off at first, just a low mechanical hum cutting through the night, then progressively louder, closer, the distinct sound of sirens approaching. Soon, blue and red lights bled into the quiet neighborhood like rising floodwater, splashing erratically across garage doors, front porches, and the dew-covered roofs of the surrounding sleepy houses. Predictably, Dogs started barking up and down the street. Curtains twitched in nearby windows. Somewhere, a motion-activated security light flickered on, adding to the surreal illumination. Ethan remained near the broken window, still gripping the fire poker, tightly breathing hard, as if he'd just run a mile underwater. The weight of the night was finally beginning to settle upon him. His father, Mark, however, remained composed. Not tense, not relaxed, just still watchful, intensely present. He knew from hard-earned experience that the most dangerous part of any engagement wasn't always the immediate threat itself. Often, it was the aftermath, the chaotic period, when good intentions could collide with misunderstanding and the truth had to fight its way into the light. So, he prepared. He carefully laid the AR-15 on the dining room table, ensuring the chamber was open and the safety engaged. Then he stepped away, raising his hands, slowly, fingers spread wide. When the squad cars pulled up seconds later, 3 black and whites followed closely by a marked K9 unit. The street lit up like a movie set. Doors flew open, boots hit the pavement, and officers moved quickly, weapons ready, voices sharp and commanding. Hands where we can see them. Mark didn't flinch. Inside, I'm unarmed, he called out, his voice calm, but carrying clearly. 2 intruders injured, 1 fled on foot, east side of the property. Flashlights cut through the interior darkness of the house, sweeping over furniture, floorboards, the stairwell. The lead officer approached cautiously, weapon lowered, but eyes intensely alert. When he saw Mark standing just inside the front door open, stance, steady voice, direct gaze, something in the officer's own posture shifted subtly. His tone leveled. "You, the homeowner?" "Yes," Mark confirmed. "Name's Mark Davis, former military. My son and daughter are upstairs. Everyone's safe." He stepped back as the officers entered, fanned out, and began systematically securing the scene. In the kitchen, they found the second man still on the floor, already stabilized by Mark's makeshift first aid, a clean dish towel cinched tightly around the shoulder wound to slow the bleeding. Nearby, the first intruder's discarded clipboard and fake HOA badge lay conspicuously on the tile. Outside in the backyard, officers spotted movement by the bushes. The third suspect, the one Ethan had forcefully stopped at the window, had attempted to slip away, but collapsed just short of the neighbor's fence, likely hampered by injuries from the broken glass or the fall. He was restrained without further incident. The fourth man, apparently a lookout, who Mark had accounted for but hadn't materialized until now, the one who'd vanished into the woods after the initial confrontation, was gone. A K9 unit started a track, but quickly lost the trail in the dense undergrowth bordering the property. Inside, Ethan sat silently on the living room couch, the fire poker resting beside him like a strange trophy. He stared at it, the sheer weight and adrenaline of the night finally catching up to him. A young, calm officer crouched beside him, asking quiet, careful questions. "What's your name, Ethan?" "You okay?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think so." Outside, neighbors began to appear cautiously. First 1 or 2, clad in robes and slippers, then more, phones inevitably in hand. Whispers passed between them like ripples spreading across a pond. Was it a break-in? Is everyone all right? Did someone really fire a gun? Didn't they say something about the HOA? Amidst the swirl of flashing lights and hushed questions, Mark stepped outside. A paramedic briefly checked his vitals, but he waved the attention off politely. "I'm fine," he stated simply. "Just want to make sure my kids are okay." And thankfully they were. A few minutes later, a senior officer asked Mark to walk him through precisely what happened. He recounted the events plainly, factually, from the initial knock to the sight of the crowbar at the window, from the clear warning shot to the armed entry, and finally to his defensive response. There were no embellishments, no dramatization, just the unvarnished truth. The officer nodded thoughtfully as he took detailed notes. "From everything I'm hearing, Key," he remarked, "you handled this by the book." Mark offered a tired half-smile. "That's always the idea." Hours later, long after the scene was cleared, the injured intruders, transported under guard, and statements meticulously taken, a local reporter inevitably caught wind of the incident. The initial headlines speculated wildly. Possible mistaken identity in late-night inspection gone wrong. But Mark knew better. These men weren't there by accident. They didn't knock with legitimate questions. They arrived with a premeditated plan, and they disastrously chose the wrong house. Standing in the pale emerging morning light, arms crossed as the last officers packed up their gear, Mark glanced back at his home. The back door was splintered, the side window shattered, but the house itself, and more importantly, everything precious that mattered inside it, was still standing. And sometimes he knew that was all the victory you needed. The headlines exploded quickly. Within 48 hours, the story escalated from a local police blotter item to statewide news and then, inevitably, national attention. It possessed all the elements that ignite social media: a quiet suburban home, brazen midnight intruders, and most compellingly, a retired Navy SEAL defending his family from armed imposters. However, what began as sensational speculation rapidly solidified into established fact. The badges the men had worn, crudely labeled with HOA logos and entirely fictitious department numbers, were confirmed to be homemade cheap laminates clipped onto generic reflective vests purchased at a local hardware store. The clipboards, too, were mere props, some even containing hastily written scripts designed to mimic legitimate inspections, complete with notes about imaginary lawn code violations, gutter compliance issues, and garage visibility standards. Furthermore, the identities of the apprehended men revealed a disturbing pattern. They were recently released offenders with long criminal records. Investigators quickly pieced together their method over the preceding 2 months. They had moved systematically across several counties, exploiting the illusion of official authority to gain access to private property. Their strategy relied entirely on homeowner confusion, the tendency to freeze up, or simple compliance born out of fear or misplaced politeness. That strategy worked flawlessly until they knocked on Mark Davis's door. Mark and Ethan hadn't just stopped a potential home invasion. They had effectively disrupted a criminal method, broken a dangerous pattern, and in doing so, forced an uncomfortable truth about vulnerability into the bright light of day. News outlets ran segments with catchy titles like "The Fake Inspectors," "How One Family Exposed a Growing Threat," and "From Backyard Burglary to Breaking News, the Real HOA Scam Uncovered." Talk shows dissected the incident, podcasts analyzed the security implications, and even major legitimate HOA organizations felt compelled to respond publicly. Within a week, official statements were issued. "We are horrified by the blatant abuse of our name and the trust homeowners place in legitimate representatives," one spokesperson declared. Consequently, new verification protocols rapidly rolled out across the county. All HOA personnel would now require city-issued identification, and any property visits would necessitate pre-notified scheduling. A dedicated tip line was established, and neighborhood watch programs saw a sudden resurgence in activity. Yet through all the ensuing media frenzy, the interviews, the cameras constantly parked down the street, the effusive praise online, Mark remained conspicuously quiet. He granted only one interview, short, polite, and characteristically straightforward. "I did what any father would do," he stated simply. "I don't care how they were dressed. They broke into my home. My family came first." For him, the ordeal was never about headlines or fleeting internet applause. It was about the profound relief of walking past Sophie's room the next morning and hearing the steady rhythm of her breathing fast asleep under her favorite blanket. It was about seeing Ethan no longer just a boy in his eyes, but something more, someone who stepped up decisively when it counted, acting without instruction, without hesitation. It was about the fundamental knowledge that even with the damage done, the splintered door, the shattered glass, the long night, they would never truly forget. The most important things remained untouched. His family was safe, and that for Mark Davis was the only story that ever truly mattered. The official decision came just 3 days later. No charges, no courtroom drama, no drawn-out, agonizing legal battle. The district attorney's office released a concise statement to the press after a thorough review of the incident and all available evidence. The homeowner's actions have been deemed lawful self-defense under state statutes. This appears to be a textbook case of defending one's home and family against a violent intrusion. And that was it. Neighbors nodded in quiet agreement. Local law enforcement publicly stood by the decision. Even the typically divisive online comment sections were largely quiet, surprisingly supportive. But Mark didn't celebrate. There was no fist pump, no triumphant social media post, no recounting of the harrowing tale to anyone who hadn't specifically asked. He simply nodded once when the news came through and then went back to work fixing his house. That afternoon, he and Ethan climbed into the attic and retrieved a patch kit. Together, they stood on a stepladder beneath the small dark hole in the hallway ceiling. A clean, round puncture surrounded by lingering dust and the sharp memory of the warning shot. Ethan held the flashlight steady. Mark carefully applied the spackle and tape. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The quiet, simple work itself felt like a small, necessary return to normalcy, the kind of mundane normal you don't truly appreciate until it's been violently interrupted. Outside, the air had finally started to warm again. Spring was arriving slowly, softly, with gentle breezes passing through the backyard, as if nothing terrifying had ever happened there just nights before. Mark wheeled the old charcoal grill out from the shed. He didn't say, "We deserve this," or "We made it through." He just lit the coals, took out 2 thick steaks, and waited patiently until the familiar comforting scent of flame and seasoning settled into the evening air. Sophie came outside first, wrapped in a fuzzy blanket, still clutching the same worn, stuffed fox she'd clung to throughout the ordeal. Ethan followed a moment later with 2 plates. Mark handed his son a can of soda. Not ceremoniously, not dramatically, just passed it over like he'd done 100 times before. "You did good," he said quietly. That was it. Ethan nodded, understanding, filling the space between them. He didn't need more than that, because the words weren't really the point. The silence was. The ordinary was. The peace they were painstakingly rebuilding, one ceiling patch, one shared meal, one knowing glance at a time, was the true reward. Time passed, as it inevitably does. The police reports were filed away. The news broadcasts stopped looping the same dramatic 20 seconds of security footage. The neighborhood gradually resumed its familiar rhythm. Garbage trucks rumbled faithfully on Mondays, sprinklers buzzed awake at sunrise, lawn chairs reappeared on front porches, and the cheerful sounds and smells of weekend barbecues once again filled the air with smoke and laughter. To an outside observer, nothing looked particularly different. But for Ethan Davis, Everything had changed. He still woke up in the same bed, still passed the same hallway mirror on his way to the kitchen, still saw his dad reading the morning paper at the table like clockwork. Yet the way he saw it all, the lens through which he now viewed his life, was irrevocably altered, because now he understood something profound, something that had never been explicitly spoken aloud, something not written in any school rule book or learned in a classroom. There are defining moments that mark the transition between boy and man, between passive routine and active responsibility, between enjoying peace and understanding the sacrifices required to maintain it. That defining moment had come for him at 3:12 a.m. on a terrifying Tuesday morning. The man who had stood unflinchingly between his family and the danger that night wasn't just his father. He was the embodiment of the line, the crucial line between right and wrong, between safety and imminent threat, between the life they cherished and what it could have instantly become in one devastatingly wrong second. Mark Davis had drawn that line quietly, decisively. He hadn't needed permission, nor had he sought recognition. He just stood there, steady, resolved, exactly where he needed to be. Ethan had grown up knowing his dad was a veteran, of course. There were service plaques discreetly displayed in the study, an old folded flag resting respectfully in a shadow box. But those had always felt like relics from a different life, artifacts from a past far removed from their quiet suburban existence. Now, however, that past life had stepped directly into theirs, not as a faded memory, but as a palpable presence, a protective shield, a latent force that still protected, driven not by residual duty, but by fierce, unwavering love. Ethan had seen a side of his father that night that most kids, thankfully, never witness, and in doing so, he had discovered a part of himself he hadn't known existed. The part that didn't freeze under pressure, the part that moved decisively, the part that stood up when it mattered most. And while the neighborhood soon tucked the unsettling story away, as people understandably do when they're fortunate enough not to be directly involved, the unspoken truth lingered just beneath the surface of everyday life. No one brought it up explicitly at block parties. No one mentioned it during the subsequent, now much more scrutinized HOA meetings. But everyone remembered. They remembered the night three men tried to weaponize fear and authority, and how they were decisively stopped by something they hadn't remotely anticipated. Not just a man with elite military training, but fundamentally a father who had already fought his share of battles and had the most compelling reason imaginable to draw the line one last resolute time. That's the harsh lesson those intruders learned behind some of those quiet suburban homes, behind the neatly manicured lawns and gently chiming wind chimes, lives a different, deeper kind of strength. It's a strength that doesn't shout or seek attention. It's simply waiting, watching, and absolutely unwilling to let evil step across the threshold. Mark Davis didn't need medals or accolades to prove anything. He had what mattered most: a family that was still whole and a son who would never forget where the line was drawn, and who stood firmly upon it when everything was at stake. This story serves as a potent reminder that vigilance is crucial even in seemingly safe environments. True threats don't always announce themselves, and sometimes the quiet strength within ordinary people, especially when protecting loved ones, is the most formidable defense. It also highlights the importance of questioning things that don't feel right, even when faced with perceived authority. Trust your instincts. What did you think of Mark and Ethan's actions? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel for more content like this.